Our next lesson in the book of Luke is an exciting one. We've come to the birth of John the Baptist as is recorded in Luke chapter 1, verses 57 through 66. I remember back when there was a lot of debate about whether or not motorcycle riders ought to be required by law to wear a motorcycle. I remember reading an article back when they were discussing this about a man that was very upset that he was being required to wear a motorcycle helmet. His words were he felt it was burdensome and troublesome. So he got together about 100 motorcyclists and they were going to ride to the state capitol to protest the law as being intrusive and unfair. So they rode their motorcycles together to the state capitol and they made their speeches and did their demonstrations. They were going to climax their demonstration by burning their helmets as a symbol of their dissatisfaction. However, on the way, one of the men had a tragic accident, and as a result, he had severe injuries that probably would not have taken place, the doctors said, if he had had a helmet on. I thought it was interesting that the guy writing the story in the newspaper made the note that he was writing to protest a law that could have saved him from a lot of pain and agony. When I was reading that story, I couldn't help think of the way people react to the Lord. We often complain that God is too restrictive with his commands. I can't believe God tells us we have to do this or that we cannot do that. And a lot of people today in our society tend to think that God's commands are outdated. They don't fit in with our modern society. And as a result, we want to tear off what we consider to be yokes or bondages of God's commandments. We tend to think that we can run our lives better than God can. We're smarter and we're advanced a lot further than they were when they wrote the Bibles. However, a lot of times I think we become like the guy on the motorcycle who had a wreck and got hurt, because the absence of what the law said was what was best for him is what really caused his injuries to be so severe. I look at our society and I see all the problems around us, and there are plenty. I see the people that are hurting. And I ask myself the question, have all of these efforts that we've made to throw off God's restrictive commandments really made us any happier? We're a more permissive and free society than we've ever been. We want to do away with the thou shalts and the thou shalt nots, and we want to be free to do whatever we want to do. But with all of that, my question is, are we any happier than we were before? Has our freedom made us more happy? I don't really think so. We have moved the restraints, but we've not discovered any more peace or joy. As a matter of fact, as I look around the world I live in, the more I see us stripping God's restrictive commands, as we call them, the more agony and pain and personal injury I see. It seems like the more we disregard God's commandments about how to live our lives, the more trouble we get into. The less restrictions we put on home and family, the more divorces we see every day. The more we tear away God's standards for morality and decency, it seems like the more disease we have to deal with. I think sometimes we're just trying to get away from what God knows is best for us. I was thinking about this when I came to the book of Luke, chapter 1, verses 57 through 66, because in this story there is a lesson on obedience and following God's commands. Let me read to you this scripture that we have about the birth of John the Baptist, and specifically Zechariah, his father. You remember he had been in the temple praying, carrying out his priestly duties, when God told him that he was going to have a son. And then he couldn't speak up until after the son was born. Now it says in verse number 57, it says, when it was time for Elizabeth to have her baby, she gave birth to a son. This will be John the Baptist, we know. Verse 58, her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown her great mercy, and they shared her joy. On the 8th day, they came to circumcise the child, and they were going to name him after his father Zechariah. But his mother spoke up and said, no, he's going to be called John. They said to her, there is no one among your relatives who has that name. Then they made signs to his father to find out what he would like to name the child. He asked for a writing tablet. Remember, he couldn't speak. And to everyone's astonishment, he wrote, his name is John. Immediately, his mouth was opened, and his tongue was set free, and he began to speak, praising God. All the neighbors were filled with awe, and throughout the hill country of Judea, people were talking about all these things. Everyone who had heard this wondered about him, asking, what then is this child going to be? For the Lord's hand was with him. I love this story about the birth of John the Baptist. It's funny how things change in society and as time goes by. In the first century, you got to remember, ladies, don't get upset. I'm just telling history. It was a male-dominated culture and society. This was before women not only had many rights, but even thought about having rights. It's still that way in a lot of the Arab countries, like we discovered in Iraq. As a matter of fact, when a child was born to a Hebrew couple, here's what would happen. All the neighbors would come and stand outside to see the new baby. Musicians would come from all over the community, and they would be there ready when the child was born. If the baby that was born was a boy, they broke out in shouting and singing. The musicians played, and they had a party. If the baby was a girl, they just all said how nice, how sweet, and they quietly went home with a little bit of disappointment. Sorry about that. You're talking to a guy that's got 3 girls. I love the girls. But in this male-dominated society, this was the case. So on this day, there was a lot of reason to celebrate. Old Zeke and Liz, as we call them, Zechariah and Elizabeth, had just had a baby. They were thrilled for a lot of reasons. They were an older couple who had not expected to have a child anymore. So they were thrilled and excited because they had seen their prayers answered and they were going to have a baby. And on top of that, this baby was a boy. So the family line would be carried on. And that was one of the reasons for the excitement. The common thing in that day was for the father to name the child. Normally he would name the child after his father or after himself. I know what that's like a little bit. I'm a junior. I'm Jack Millwood Jr., named after my father. My son, we didn't quite pull off naming him the third, but he has my initials. My grandson has our same initials. We're all JBM. So I understand that tradition. Everybody named their son in some way after their father. It gave or used some kind of derivative of the father's name. When they named the child, it wasn't just like we do it. You know, at the hospital, you're down there and the nurse comes in and say, we need to fill out these papers. And she casually says, what's the name? And y'all stand there looking at each other going, we talked about this for 9 months, but we still haven't made a decision. Then on the 8th day of the child's birth, they would have a party and they would circumcise the child. This was a way of saying that the child was a Jew or a descendant of Abraham. And on this day, they would name the child. So they looked at Elizabeth and said, we're going to name him something after Zeke. Name him Little Zeke. You got to remember, Zechariah couldn't speak for himself. But Elizabeth said, no way, we're not naming him Little Zeke, or Zechariah. We're naming him John. And all the people looked at her strangely and said, why in the world are you naming this baby John? Nobody in your family is named John. And she just said, look, I'm telling you, this baby's going to be named John. So they said, oh, this woman, she didn't know what they're talking about. So we'll ask Daddy. And Daddy couldn't talk, of course, so they said something to him, and he asked for a writing tablet. And he wrote down on the tablet, look at what he wrote. He wrote, his name is John. It's significant that he didn't say his name's going to be John or we're going to call him John. He wrote, his name is John. Now, you got to remember, Zechariah had been in the temple when God told him he was going to have a son. And God had told him back in the previous verses, you will name him John. So this is significant. It would have been an act of disobedience to name him anything other than John. When Zeke said his name is John, he was obeying what God had told him. He didn't let his emotions get by with him, or he didn't let the crowd use peer pressure to get him to call him something else. He simply wrote on the tablet, his name is John. And the significance here is he was obeying God's command. There is a significance to the names given to people in the Bible. For example, God said, I am. That was his name, Yahweh. We don't have a time to look into that, but it's a significant name that God is who creates everything else. You remember God changed Abram's name to Abraham because he was going to be the father of many nations. Jacob, whose name meant conniver or trickerer. When God got hold of his heart, his name was changed to Israel. That meant Prince of God. Zechariah's name was important. The name Zechariah means God remembers his covenant. Isn't it neat that his name was God will remember his covenant? And then God came to him in his old age and said, I've not forgotten what I promised. I'm going to give you a child. Even Elizabeth's name means God is faithful. And the birth of this baby is proof that God was faithful. So Zechariah's name and Elizabeth's name is symbolic of what happened in their life. God was faithful to remember his covenant. So it would have been easy to name this baby Zechariah, God's covenant's kept, something like that. But they named him John. The name John means gift of God or gracious gift of God. You got to remember that God didn't give this baby to Zeke and Liz just so that they would have a child. God was giving a gift to the whole world and to the nation of Israel in the person of who we come to know as John the Baptist. He was a gift to his family, to his nation, and to the world because he was going to be the forerunner of the Messiah, the Son of God, Jesus. So he said his name will be called John. I like he said his name is John because he wasn't about to name the child. The child had been named 9 months earlier. Now, we'll get into this in our next study. But the moment old Zeke wrote, his name is John, his tongue was loosened and he was able to talk again for the first time in 9 months. It was a sign that God was honoring his act of obedience. I want to end our little study today by reminding you and me that it's important to obey God. When God tells us what to do, we need to be obedient, obey it, and honor God with our obedience. Don't fall into the trap of thinking God's commandments are restrictive. They are protective. God gives us commands for a reason, and we are to honor and to keep those commandments. I'm excited to show you what else you learn about this simple naming of John the Baptist and this act of obedience. We'll do it in our next study. God bless.